I still remember the exact moment she looked at me with disgust, as if I wasn't even human. Her eyes narrowed, her lips curled into a half-smile that carried more poison than words ever could. And in that instant, I felt the weight of every invisible chain that tied me to the bottom of society. I was just a driver, wearing a worn-out uniform with sleeves that carried the smell of gasoline and sweat. A man whose existence was confined to the back seat of someone else's car. Yet I was also a man with a storm of dreams burning silently inside me, dreams that no one ever cared to see, let alone believe in. That afternoon, the sun was merciless, beating down on the streets, making the asphalt shimmer like it was alive. I had been waiting by the curbside, leaning against the car that wasn't mine but was entrusted to me, when she appeared. She was the kind of woman who looked as though she had never known struggle, draped in expensive clothes that seemed to scream her status before she even opened her mouth. Her heels clicked against the pavement in a rhythm that demanded attention. Her perfume carried on the air like a silent announcement of her superiority, and the moment she saw me holding the car door open for her, she paused. It was not the pause of recognition, not the pause of kindness. It was the pause of judgment. Her eyes scanned me from head to toe as though every inch of me was a reminder of everything she believed she was above. I remember the words she spoke, because they were carved into me like a blade. She said, with a mocking little laugh, "Do you really think someone like me could ever look twice at someone like you? You're just a driver. That's all you'll ever be." She didn't whisper it. She didn't try to soften it. She said it loud enough for the people around us to hear, loud enough that the group standing near the cafe turned their heads, and loud enough that my pride shattered right there in the open air. The laughter that followed from her friends was worse than the words themselves. It was the laughter of people who lived in a world where men like me were nothing but shadows, invisible, unless they made mistakes. I felt my ears burn, my chest tighten, and though I wanted to disappear into the ground, I forced myself to stand there, gripping the car door, forcing my face into the stillness of a mask, because if I let them see the tears that wanted to escape, I would give them even more power than they already had. But inside, I was bleeding. Each word she spoke cut deeper than I could explain, not just because of the insult, but because she had confirmed what the world always whispered in my ears, that my dreams didn't matter, that my hard work didn't matter, that my place in life had already been decided for me long before I was born. Poverty was not just in my empty wallet. It was in the way people like her made me feel, as though even daring to dream was a crime. That night, when I lay on the thin mattress in my cramped room, her words repeated themselves like a cruel echo, bouncing inside my skull until I wanted to scream. "Just a driver. That's all you'll ever be." I stared at the cracked ceiling, feeling a mix of anger and shame I had never known before, and I realized that something inside me had shifted. I could not go on like this, not because of her, not because I needed to prove her wrong, but because in that humiliation, I finally saw the truth of my own life. I had been surviving, not living, breathing but not moving, existing in the shadow of other people's power. And that night, I swore to myself that it would not remain that way forever. The rejection she gave me became a scar I carried everywhere, but scars have a strange power. They remind you of where you've been, but they also remind you never to go back. Every insult, every laugh, every dismissive glance became fuel for me, a fire that burned hotter than the sun that had witnessed my shame. I didn't know how, I didn't know when, but I knew with a clarity that shook me to my core that I would not die a driver. I would not leave this world unnoticed, unheard, or forgotten. Still, the pain of that day lingered in ways I couldn't escape. The city looked different afterward. Every time I drove past a tall glass building, I didn't just see windows reflecting the sky. I saw a life that was denied to me, A life where people like her lived without ever worrying about the things that consumed my nights. Each trip I made behind the wheel became a silent conversation with myself, a vow that I was preparing for something greater, even though I had no idea where to begin. It's strange how one moment can become the turning point of an entire life. To her, it was nothing. Just a cruel joke, a passing insult that she probably forgot by the time she sat down to sip her coffee. But to me, it was the spark that ignited a fire I couldn't put out. It became the story I replayed in my head every time I wanted to give up. The reason I stayed awake when exhaustion begged me to close my eyes. The voice that pushed me to believe that maybe, just maybe, I could prove everyone wrong. That day broke me. Yes, but it also rebuilt me. It forced me to confront the harsh truth that life wasn't going to hand me respect, that dignity wouldn't come wrapped in pity, and that success wasn't waiting around the corner like some gift. I would have to carve it out of stone with my own 2 hands, and the first strike of the chisel began with her laughter. What she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that the poor driver she mocked would one day return, not in the shadow of someone else's car, but in a place she could never have imagined, a place where I would hold the power, where I would sit at the head of the table, and where she would no longer look down on me, but look up in disbelief. And as fate would have it, that day was closer than either of us could have known. Her words did not end that day. They followed me like shadows I could not escape. Even as I went about my work, gripping the steering wheel and forcing a polite smile for passengers, the sound of her laughter, the sharpness of her voice, and the cruel certainty in her tone echoed in my ears until I could no longer tell whether it was memory or reality. "You'll never be more than a driver," she had said, and those words became chains wrapped around my chest, tightening every time I dared to dream. I tried to push them away, to drown them under the weight of long hours and endless roads. But at night, when the city grew quiet and my body finally collapsed onto my mattress, they came back stronger than ever. I would stare at the ceiling, my hands clenched into fists, replaying the scene again and again, wishing I had said something back, wishing I had defended myself, wishing I had shown her that I was not as small as she believed. But all I had done was stand there, silent, swallowing my humiliation, and now the silence haunted me more than her insult ever could. The truth is, poverty doesn't just empty your wallet. It empties your spirit. It convinces you that people like her are right, that the best you can hope for is to remain invisible, to serve quietly, to survive without ever demanding more. Every morning when I put on my uniform, I felt the weight of that truth pressing on me. I carried not just the burden of my work, but the burden of a broken pride, a pride that had been stepped on in front of strangers who didn't even care enough to look at me twice. But pride, when broken, has 2 paths. It can destroy you, or it can build something inside you that is unshakable. For weeks after that humiliation, I felt like I was on the edge of destruction. I drove passengers while my mind wandered into dangerous places, questioning my worth, my future, my very existence. The laughter I heard that day became the soundtrack of my failures, and sometimes I wondered if it was even worth fighting anymore. Yet in the quietest hours, when doubt screamed the loudest, something inside me whispered a different story. That whisper said I could not allow her words to define me. That whisper said I had more to give, more to become, more to prove. Not to her, not even to the world, but to myself. I could not let the rest of my life be dictated by the arrogance of someone who believed wealth was the only measure of humanity. Still, determination alone did not erase the weight I carried. Every mistake I made behind the wheel reminded me of her insult. Every time someone snapped their fingers at me as though I were nothing more than an extension of the car, I felt my pride crumble a little more. And yet, paradoxically, the heavier the burden became, the more fuel it gave me to change. It was as though life itself was testing me, seeing if I would break under the weight or learn to carry it with strength. One evening, after another long day of endless driving, I caught my reflection in the rearview mirror. For the first time, I didn't just see a tired man in a cheap uniform. I saw someone who was alive but not living. Someone who had been waiting for life to hand him something when life had already made it clear it would give nothing freely. In that reflection, I saw the choice I had been avoiding. Either I would accept the burden of broken pride and let it crush me, or I would use it to forge a new version of myself. That night, I made a silent vow. I promised myself that I would never again let someone else's opinion dictate my future. I promised myself that one day I would rise high enough that even those who mocked me would have no choice but to acknowledge my existence. I didn't know how I would do it, but I knew the fire had been lit, and it would never go out. The burden did not grow lighter overnight. In fact, it often grew heavier, pressing down on me with every failure, every setback, every reminder of where I came from. But instead of letting it break me, I learned to carry it differently. I let it sharpen me, let it remind me why I had to keep going, let it become the silent voice that whispered, "Don't stop now." And so I began to change. I stopped wasting nights in despair and started spending them in learning. I read everything I could get my hands on, books about business, stories of men who had risen from nothing, lessons on leadership, finance, and growth. I studied not because I had the luxury of education, but because I could not afford ignorance anymore. Every page I turned, every word I absorbed, became another stone laid on the path out of the life I was trapped in. But even as I built this quiet resolve, the memory of her insult remained. It was both a wound and a weapon. Whenever exhaustion threatened to pull me under, I heard her voice again, dripping with arrogance, and it gave me the strength to push through one more hour, one more page, one more mile. The burden of my broken pride was still heavy, but I had begun to understand that it was also the foundation on which my future would stand. What I did not realize then was that life wasn't finished testing me. That vow I made in the silence of my room was only the beginning. Before I could rise, I would have to be broken again, harder and deeper than before. The burden I thought was heavy now was nothing compared to the storm waiting ahead. A storm that would either bury me forever or forge me into something unrecognizable. While she flaunted her wealth, carrying herself through life as if every luxury was a birthright carved into her existence, I walked through a different reality that she would never understand. To her, the world was wide and glittering, filled with parties in grand halls, dinners under chandeliers, and laughter that floated above the worries of ordinary people. To me, the world was a narrow space, a cramped apartment where the walls carried the smell of old paint and dampness, a space where the thin mattress I slept on sagged under my weight, where the buzzing of a broken ceiling fan was the closest thing I had to comfort. My mornings began not with breakfast served on polished tables, but with the dull ache of hunger gnawing at my stomach. There were days when I skipped meals entirely so I could stretch what little money I had for rent or fuel. Days when the clinking of coins in my pocket reminded me of everything I lacked. Second-hand clothes clung to me like shadows of lives already lived by others. Shoes with worn soles carried me through streets that never seemed to notice my presence. And each step was a reminder that I was invisible in a society that only respected wealth. And yet, behind closed doors, away from the noise of the world, I carried a secret that even poverty could not steal from me. I studied. I read. I devoured every scrap of knowledge I could find as if it were food for my starving soul. Old, borrowed books became treasures to me, pages worn thin by fingers that had searched them before mine, words underlined by strangers who, like me, had once been desperate to find a way out. At night, when the city lights dimmed and silence settled over the streets, I sat under the weak glow of a lamp that flickered with every surge of power, turning page after page, filling my mind with visions of a life that seemed impossibly far away. I read about men who had started with nothing and built empires from dust, about leaders who turned rejection into strength, about dreamers who refused to bow to the limitations of their circumstances. Every story I absorbed became a piece of armor, shielding me from the insults I endured by day. I began to believe that maybe my life was not a curse but a test, and if I could endure it long enough, there might be something waiting for me beyond the horizon. Of course, to the outside world, I was still nothing but a driver. People climbed into the back seat of the car without looking me in the eye, tossing words at me as if I were part of the engine, not a human being with thoughts, feelings, or dreams. They never asked me what I wanted from life, never imagined that the man holding the wheel might be holding ambitions larger than theirs. I became a shadow in their world, someone who existed to serve, someone whose worth ended the moment the ride did. But in the shadows of society, I began to see a different truth. While the wealthy lived blinded by their comforts, I could see cracks they never noticed. They wasted money without thought, but I studied every penny, learning the value of discipline. They relied on connections inherited by birth, but I knew that real connections were forged in struggle, through shared battles and scars. Their world was built on illusions of permanence, but I was learning that nothing in life was truly permanent. Not poverty, not pain, not even humiliation. Still, the gap between their world and mine felt endless. On some nights, when exhaustion overwhelmed me, I questioned whether my dreams were foolish. I wondered if I was destined to remain in the shadows, forever watching others live the kind of life I could only imagine. Yet every time doubt threatened to drown me, I remembered her. The girl who had looked at me as though I were beneath her notice, who had spoken words sharp enough to cut me open. Remembering her arrogance reignited the fire inside me, reminding me why I could not allow myself to give up. I started keeping a notebook where I wrote down every lesson I learned, every idea that came to me, every small step I could take toward a future that seemed impossibly far away. Those pages became my map, a record of a journey that had not yet begun, but that I refused to abandon. Slowly, the life I lived and the life I dreamed began to overlap, not in reality, but in the certainty I carried within me. It was not an easy path. Hunger still clawed at me, bills still piled up on my table, and every day I put on the same uniform and drove the same car, carrying passengers who looked past me as though I were invisible. But while they ignored me, I was watching them, studying their habits, their conversations, their way of thinking. Every ride became a classroom. Every word I overheard a lesson. The irony was not lost on me, that the people who dismissed me as nothing more than a driver were unknowingly teaching me how to become more than they could ever imagine. And then, one evening, as I sat in that same small apartment with my notebook open and my mind restless, something happened that shifted everything. An opportunity came my way, unexpected and frightening, the kind of chance that could either lift me out of the shadows or bury me deeper in them forever. It was not a gift wrapped in gold, not a simple handout, but a door left slightly ajar, waiting for me to decide whether I had the courage to step through it. Taking it would mean risking everything I had, my little savings, the fragile balance I had built, the thin thread of stability that kept me from collapse. But if I didn't take it, I knew I would remain trapped in the life I had always known, condemned to remain in a world she could never see, a world where dreams were swallowed by hunger and hope died quietly in dark rooms. And as I stared at that opportunity, heart racing, I realized that this was the moment that would test whether the fire inside me was strong enough to survive the storm. My nights weren't for sleeping. They were for planning, for building castles in the dark that no one could see but me, While others surrendered to rest after long days, I forced myself awake, sitting at a small wooden table scarred with age, its surface littered with notebooks, torn pages, and the faint stains of coffee that had long gone cold. Outside, the city slept in silence. But within the walls of my cramped apartment, my mind was alive, racing with visions of a life that felt impossibly distant, yet undeniably real in the world I created inside my head. The opportunity that had come my way lingered in my thoughts, like a candle flame flickering in the wind. It was small, fragile, and uncertain, but it was light in a darkness I had grown too accustomed to. I spent hours weighing it, mapping it, questioning it, as if by sheer force of thought I could turn risk into certainty. I had little money, barely enough to survive the month, but the thought of using what little I had to take this chance haunted me. Fear whispered that I could lose everything. Hope shouted that maybe, just maybe, I could win. Those nights of study and planning became my secret rebellion against the life I had been handed. I read until my eyes burned, until the words on the pages blurred into one another, until dawn painted the sky with the first shades of light. Finance, leadership, strategy, even psychology. Anything I could get my hands on became a weapon I added to my arsenal. I was no longer just a driver living in the shadows. In those hours of solitude, I became a student of possibility, a builder of dreams. The hunger that gnawed at me during the day became a strange kind of fuel at night. It sharpened my focus, reminding me of why I could not afford to waste time, why I could not allow comfort to dull my ambition. Every growl of my empty stomach was a reminder that I was fighting for more than survival. I was fighting for freedom. I imagined myself one day walking into places I was never allowed, sitting at tables where decisions were made, commanding the kind of respect that money alone could not buy. Still, the darkness often played tricks on me. Doubt crept in like an intruder, whispering that I was chasing illusions, that dreams could not fill empty pockets or silence the cruel laughter of those who had already decided my worth. Some nights I sat with my head in my hands, wondering if I was simply lying to myself, if all this effort would amount to nothing more than words scribbled in notebooks no one would ever read. Yet, even in those moments, something inside me refused to let go. It was as though the very pain of rejection had carved a permanent mark in my soul, a reminder that surrender was no longer an option. I began testing myself in small ways. I started investing tiny amounts of money into ventures others dismissed as insignificant, reselling goods, learning trades, experimenting with ideas that failed more often than they succeeded. Each failure stung, especially when it meant losing money I couldn't afford to lose. But each failure also taught me lessons no book could teach. Slowly, painfully, I was learning to think differently, to act differently, to step into a mindset that wasn't bound by the walls of my reality. Sometimes, while driving passengers late at night, I would catch glimpses of the life I was chasing. I would drop someone off at a glittering building, watch them walk through glass doors with confidence that seemed untouchable, and I would sit behind the wheel imagining what it might feel like to belong there. In those moments, the distance between who I was and who I wanted to be felt unbearable, but it also fueled me. The pain of not yet arriving was the proof that I was still moving forward. The dreams I built in the dark were fragile, yes, but they were also powerful. They gave me a reason to wake up each morning and endure the monotony of being overlooked. They gave me armor against the sting of insults, protection against the despair of poverty. They were the quiet whispers of hope in a world that screamed only of limitations. But as the weeks passed and the opportunity before me grew clearer, I realized that dreaming alone would never be enough. Plans written in notebooks, visions built in my mind, they all meant nothing unless I found the courage to step beyond the safety of imagination. The thought terrified me. If I tried and failed, I would not just lose money, I would lose the fragile hope I had built, the fire that kept me alive. Yet if I never tried, I would forever remain trapped in the same cycle, a prisoner of both poverty and fear. It was during one of those long nights, my table lit only by the dim glow of a single bulb, that I made the decision. My hand trembled as I wrote it down in my notebook. I will take the risk. Those 4 words stared back at me, bold and final, sealing a promise I could no longer escape. And so, with a heart pounding in both terror and excitement, I prepared myself to step into the unknown. I didn't know if it would lift me higher than I had ever been, or shatter me into pieces too small to recover. All I knew was that I could no longer remain where I was. The dreams I had built in the dark demanded life in the light, and the only way forward was to gamble everything I had. What I could not have known was that this risk, this single step into the unknown, would not just change my path, it would tear apart everything I thought I understood about struggle, loyalty, and ambition. Because the moment I acted on my dream, betrayal was waiting in the shadows, ready to strike in a way that would nearly destroy me. I thought nothing could hurt worse than her rejection. Nothing could cut deeper than the laughter that had reduced me to less than a man. But I was wrong. Life has a way of teaching lessons in layers, and just when you think you've endured the worst it can offer, it reveals another level of pain waiting to break you. For me, that moment came when betrayal found its way into my life. Not from a stranger, but from the one person I trusted the most. I had finally worked up the courage to take the risk I had planned for so long. I poured what little savings I had into the venture, believing it to be the first true step out of poverty, the first chance at building something that belonged to me. I wasn't reckless. I had calculated, studied, written down every possible scenario in the pages of my notebooks. I knew it wouldn't be easy, but I believed I was ready. What I wasn't ready for was betrayal dressed as friendship. He was someone I had considered a brother. We had shared meals when food was scarce, shared laughter in the middle of despair, and shared dreams about escaping the life that seemed to trap us both. When I told him about my plan, about the opportunity that could change everything, he listened with an eagerness that made me believe he was as invested as I was. He offered to help, to partner with me, to share the burden so that we could rise together. And because my heart still believed in loyalty, I trusted him. At first, everything seemed fine. The investment was small but promising, and together we spoke of the future as though it were already within our grasp. I worked twice as hard, splitting my hours between driving during the day and planning with him at night. For the first time in my life, I felt that I wasn't walking this path alone, that maybe my burden could be shared, and that friendship could be the foundation of success. But one evening, when I went to meet him as we had planned, I found nothing. He was gone. The money was gone. The opportunity was gone. All that remained was the echo of my own foolishness ringing in my ears. He had taken everything and disappeared without a trace, leaving me with empty hands, heavier debts, and a heart that had been ripped apart more violently than ever before. The pain of poverty is sharp, but the pain of betrayal is unbearable. I remember sitting alone that night, staring at the table where our plans once lay scattered, realizing that every word he had spoken, every promise he had made, had been nothing more than lies. My chest felt hollow, my throat burned, and I could not stop the tears from falling. I had been betrayed not just financially, but emotionally, spiritually, and completely. It broke me in ways that even her insult had not. Her rejection had given me fire, but his betrayal threatened to extinguish it completely. For days, I wandered in a haze, going through the motions of work, without truly being present. I drove passengers while my mind drifted elsewhere, consumed by anger, shame, and grief. I felt like a fool, not only for trusting him, but for believing that I could rise at all. Perhaps the world was right. Perhaps men like me were destined to remain where we were, trapped in the cycle of servitude and invisibility. Every night I returned to my small room, staring at the notebooks filled with plans that now seemed meaningless. What use were dreams if trust could be broken so easily, if one betrayal could erase years of effort? I began to question not just my future, but my very identity. Who was I to believe I could build something better? Who was I to think I could escape the fate that had been assigned to me from birth? The days blurred into one another, heavy with despair. I stopped studying, stopped writing, stopped believing. My body went through the motions of survival, but my spirit was collapsing under the weight of disappointment. Hunger, once a motivator, now felt like punishment. The city that had once whispered opportunities to me now screamed of defeat. And yet, even in that abyss, a small, stubborn part of me refused to die. Pain has a way of revealing truths you never wanted to face, and in my lowest point, I realized something I had overlooked. Betrayal had not destroyed me. It had stripped me bare. It had forced me to see who I could and could not trust, what I could and could not depend on. It had shown me that if I wanted to rise, I could not lean on others to carry me. I had to build a foundation so strong that no betrayal, no insult, no rejection could ever break it again. But that realization did not come in a moment of inspiration. It came in a moment of rage. I remember standing in front of the mirror, looking into my own tired eyes, and saying out loud, "This is not how my story ends." The voice that came out of me was not broken. It was angry, it was defiant, it was alive. Betrayal had taken everything I had, but it had also left me with something powerful. Nothing left to lose. And with nothing left to lose, I began to climb again. Slowly, painfully, I returned to my books, my notebooks, my long nights of study. The betrayal still burned, but I used the fire differently this time. Instead of letting it consume me, I fed it into the furnace of my ambition. Each page I turned was an act of defiance. Each plan I scribbled a declaration that I was not finished. What I didn't know then was that this climb from my lowest point would bring me face to face with someone who would change everything. A figure who carried not betrayal, but wisdom. A man whose presence would force me to see myself in ways I never had before. The world had taken everything from me, but it was about to give me something unexpected. The mentor who would shape the man I was destined to become. He was the kind of man I always wanted to be. Confident, powerful, respected. The first time I saw him, he didn't need to speak for me to feel his presence. It was in the way he walked into a room, the way people instinctively stepped aside. The way silence followed him, not because he demanded it, but because he had earned it. He wasn't dressed in flamboyant luxury, nor did he wear his wealth like a weapon. Instead, his aura spoke louder than gold ever could. This was a man who had carved his place in the world with his own hands. And from the moment I laid eyes on him, I knew that I needed to learn from him. It happened unexpectedly, as most turning points do. I had been driving one late evening, my mind still heavy with the scars of betrayal, when he became my passenger. He slid into the back seat of my car with a quiet grace, his voice steady as he gave me his destination. At first he was just another passenger, another fare in a day filled with nameless faces. But as the journey stretched on, I caught fragments of his phone conversation. Discussions about contracts, investments, leadership decisions spoken with a calm certainty that told me this man was no ordinary businessman. Something inside me stirred. I listened carefully, every word igniting the same fire I used to feel before my trust had been broken. When he hung up the phone, silence filled the car, and I found myself at war with my own fear. Part of me wanted to remain invisible, to simply drop him off and move on. But another part, The part that refused to die even in my lowest point urged me to speak. My hands gripped the steering wheel as I forced the words out. "Sir, if you don't mind me saying, I admire the way you speak about business. I've always wanted to learn how men like you think." There was a pause, the kind that felt like it stretched into eternity. I regretted it instantly, fearing I had overstepped my role, that he would dismiss me as just another driver trying to rise above his station. But instead, I heard him chuckle softly, not with mockery, but with amusement. "You don't hear that every day," he said, leaning forward slightly. "Most people only care about the ride being smooth. What's your name, son?" I told him my name, my voice unsteady, and for the rest of that drive, we spoke. Not as driver and passenger, but as two men standing on opposite sides of life's spectrum. I told him about my hunger to learn, about the betrayal that had nearly broken me, about the fire that still refused to die within me. He listened, truly listened, and when we arrived at his destination, he handed me his card. "Come see me tomorrow," he said. "If you're serious about what you just told me, prove it." That night, sleep was impossible. His words played in my mind again and again. Was this real? Could it be possible that fate had placed me in the path of someone who could teach me what I needed to know? Or was this another test, another chance for disappointment? I didn't know, but I knew I had to try. I couldn't afford to let fear dictate my steps anymore. The next day, I stood outside his office building, my stomach twisting with nerves, my hands clammy as I clutched his card like it was a lifeline. When I finally walked in, the scale of his world overwhelmed me. Polished floors that reflected the light like water, walls lined with books and art that spoke of culture and taste, employees moving with quiet efficiency, each carrying themselves with pride. I felt small, like an intruder in a world I had no right to enter. And yet, when I stepped into his office, he greeted me with the same calm presence he had shown in the car. From that day forward, I entered his shadow. He became more than a mentor. He became the mirror in which I saw both my weaknesses and my potential. He never flattered me, never softened his words. Instead, he stripped away every illusion I carried. He told me bluntly that I was undisciplined, that I lacked focus, that my ambition would eat me alive unless I learned control. His lessons were not gentle. They were sharp, relentless, and often painful. But in his harshness, I saw truth, and in his truth, I found direction. He taught me the value of patience, the art of listening more than speaking, the discipline of waking before the sun, and working until exhaustion had nothing left to take. He showed me how money moved like water, flowing toward those who knew how to guide it, and slipping away from those who did not. He taught me that leadership was not about commanding others, but about mastering yourself. Under his guidance, I began to change, not overnight, but piece by piece, shedding the skin of the man I had been and stepping into the shape of the man I could become. There were days when I wanted to quit, when his expectations felt like chains too heavy to bear. But every time I thought of walking away, I remembered her. The rich girl who had humiliated me, the friend who had betrayed me, the endless voices of those who believed I would never rise. And in those memories, I found the strength to endure. The more time I spent under his shadow, the more I realized that he was not simply teaching me business, he was teaching me how to see the world differently. Where I once saw barriers, he showed me opportunities. Where I once saw rejection, he showed me resilience. Where I once saw poverty as a curse, he showed me how it could be the foundation of strength if I used it correctly. But with every lesson came a price. The more I grew, the more sacrifices I had to make. Time with friends faded, moments of leisure disappeared, and even the smallest indulgences became luxuries I could no longer afford. My life became a cycle of work, study, and discipline, and while it shaped me into someone new, it also demanded pieces of me I wasn't always ready to give. Still, I stayed, I endured, because for the first time in my life, I could see a clear path forward. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't guaranteed, but it was real. And I knew that if I stayed in his shadow long enough, I might one day step into my own light. What I did not know, what I could not have prepared for, was that the sacrifices required of me were far greater than I had imagined. The road to becoming someone new would demand not just my time, not just my effort, but pieces of my soul. And soon, I would face choices that would test not only my ambition, but my very humanity. Success doesn't come free. It comes at the cost of blood, sweat, and tears, and though people admire the results, they rarely understand the sacrifices that build them. Under my mentor's guidance, I began to rise, but with each step forward, something was taken from me. At first, I thought it was just time. Hours that stretched into the night as I studied numbers, strategies, and leadership principles until my eyes blurred with exhaustion. But time was only the beginning. Slowly, success began demanding pieces of me I had never expected to give. The first price I paid was sleep. Where once I had struggled to rest because of hunger or despair, now I could not rest because of ambition. My mind refused to be quiet, racing with ideas, calculations, and plans. I rose before the sun, often surviving on only a few hours of rest, forcing my body to function on determination alone. Fatigue became a permanent shadow, but I accepted it because every hour spent awake brought me closer to the man I wanted to become. Then came the sacrifice of relationships. Friends who once laughed with me in moments of scarcity began to drift away. Some resented the change in me, accusing me of abandoning them, of believing I was better than them now that I walked a different path. Others simply couldn't keep up with the relentless discipline that governed my days. I stopped going to gatherings, stopped indulging in casual conversations, stopped entertaining anything that didn't align with my vision. Loneliness wrapped itself around me, but I endured it, telling myself that the path to greatness was never meant to be crowded. Even my family began to feel the distance. Calls went unanswered, visits became rare, and though I still loved them deeply, my pursuit consumed me so completely that I often forgot to express it. I told myself that one day, when I achieved everything I was working toward, I would give them the life they deserved, and they would forgive the years I seemed absent. But deep down, I wondered if success was already stealing moments I would never get back. The price of success was not only emotional, but physical. My body ached constantly. My health wavered under the strain of long hours, poor meals, and endless stress. Some mornings my reflection in the mirror startled me. Sunken eyes, pale skin, and a weariness etched so deeply into my face that I barely recognized the man staring back. But I pushed through, convincing myself that temporary suffering was nothing compared to the permanence of achievement. Perhaps the greatest price, however, was the weight on my spirit. Success requires choices, and not all of them are clean. There were times when I had to make decisions that blurred the line between right and wrong. Times when I had to be ruthless in ways that kept me awake at night. My mentor often reminded me, greatness is not built on comfort, it's built on sacrifice. If you're not willing to bleed for it, don't expect to own it. I held on to his words, but sometimes, in the silence of the night, I wondered what kind of man I was becoming. Yet, with every sacrifice, results began to show. Small victories turned into larger ones. Opportunities that once seemed distant began to unfold before me. I started earning respect in rooms where I had once been invisible. Men and women who would never have glanced my way now listened when I spoke. For the first time, I felt the intoxicating taste of influence, the undeniable proof that the suffering was not in vain. But the truth about success is that the higher you climb, the more fragile the air becomes. Every step upward demanded even greater sacrifices, and I began to realize that ambition was both a gift and a curse. The driver I once was had been replaced by a man so consumed with the pursuit of power that sometimes I wondered if I had lost more than I had gained. There were nights when I returned to my small apartment, collapsed on the chair beside my desk, and asked myself if this was truly worth it. Was success supposed to feel like triumph, or was it supposed to feel like constant exhaustion, like carrying the weight of the world on your shoulders with no promise of relief? I didn't have the answer, but I knew I couldn't stop. The pain of continuing was heavy, but the pain of giving up would have been unbearable. My mentor's words echoed constantly in my mind. You must decide what you're willing to lose to win. At first, I thought I understood what he meant, but as I watched friendships fade, as I felt my body weaken, as I buried parts of my humanity beneath layers of discipline and ambition, I realized I was only beginning to understand the depth of his warning. Success doesn't ask politely. It takes, and it keeps taking, until you wonder if there will be anything left of you when the journey is over. Still, I pressed forward. The image of her, the girl who once humiliated me, remained etched in my memory, not as a source of hatred, but as a reminder of why I could never go back. I would rather bleed, rather sacrifice every ounce of myself than allow her words to become true. But life has a cruel sense of timing. Just when I began to see the results of my sacrifices, just when I thought the suffering was beginning to make sense, a moment arrived that tested me in ways I had never imagined. An opportunity was placed before me, larger than anything I had ever encountered. But to seize it, I would have to risk not just my time, not just my health, but everything I had built so far. And as I stood on the edge of that decision, staring into the vast unknown, I realized that the price of success was about to demand more than I had ever been willing to give. I'll never forget the first time I signed a contract worth more money than I had ever seen in my life. It wasn't just ink on paper. It was proof that the endless nights, the sacrifices, the hunger, and the loneliness had not been for nothing. As the pen moved across the page, my hand trembled, not from fear, but from the weight of what it represented. For the first time, I was no longer the invisible driver people looked past. For the first time, I had stepped into the light of a world I had only ever studied from the shadows. The opportunity had come disguised as a risk, as they always do. A small company on the edge of collapse was desperate for someone to breathe life into it. Everyone else saw a sinking ship. I saw potential. I saw a chance to test everything I had learned under my mentor's guidance, to prove that I was no longer just dreaming but capable of acting. I poured everything I had into that deal. My money, my time, my energy, my very spirit. It was reckless in some ways, terrifying in others. But when the results began to show, I knew I had made the right decision. The company turned around slowly, at first, like a wounded animal learning to stand again. Every day was a battle, every decision a test, and there were moments I feared it would collapse in my hands. But piece by piece, brick by brick, I rebuilt it, applying every principle my mentor had drilled into me. I learned how to manage people, how to inspire them when morale was low, how to cut costs without cutting dignity, how to take risks that frightened everyone else but made sense to me. And when profits finally came in, when the red numbers turned to black, it felt like breathing after drowning for years. That first victory was not just financial. It was personal. It was the validation I had craved since the day she humiliated me, the proof that her words were not prophecy but ignorance. I remember standing in that small office late one night, staring at the first profit report and feeling tears burn my eyes. I had done it. Against every odd, against every insult, against every betrayal, I had created something that worked. Word of my success began to spread. Men who had once dismissed me started calling. Meetings that would have been closed to me before now welcomed me. Slowly, I began to move into circles where wealth and power were not just admired, but expected. The respect I received was intoxicating. People looked me in the eye now. They shook my hand firmly, asked for my opinion, and listened when I spoke. It was everything I had once dreamed of, and yet it also frightened me, because with success came new challenges. The higher I climbed, the more eyes were on me, the more pressure weighed on my shoulders. Every victory attracted attention, some genuine, some dangerous. Competitors saw me not as a young man rising, but as a threat to their dominance. Friends I had once trusted grew distant or resentful, unable to reconcile the man I was becoming with the man they once knew. The air at the top was thin, and while it tasted of triumph, it also carried the bitterness of isolation. But even with the weight of those challenges, nothing could erase the feeling of that first victory. It became my anchor, the memory I returned to whenever doubt tried to creep back into my mind. It reminded me that I was not the poor driver people had once mocked. I was not the man defined by rejection or betrayal. I was a builder, a fighter, a man capable of turning dreams into reality. My mentor's pride was subtle, but I could see it in his eyes when he congratulated me. "This is only the beginning," he said, his voice calm but firm. And I believed him. That first victory was not the end of the road. It was the foundation for something far greater. It was proof that I could rise, but also a challenge to rise higher. As months turned into years, one victory led to another. Deals grew larger, opportunities more complex, and my influence wider. The man who once drove strangers around the city now sat in boardrooms, signing papers that determined the future of hundreds of employees. It felt surreal at times, as though I were living in someone else's story, but I knew every step had been paid for in blood, sweat, and sacrifice. And yet, even as my life transformed, I never forgot where it all began. In quiet moments, I still thought of her. The girl who had once looked at me with disgust, who had spoken words that had burned themselves into my soul. I wondered where she was, if she still walked through life with the same arrogance, if she ever thought about the boy she had humiliated. I told myself it didn't matter, that I no longer needed her recognition. But deep down, I knew the story between us was not finished, and fate, with its cruel and poetic sense of timing, had been waiting patiently. Because one day, in the midst of my victories, in the height of my success, the past I thought I had left behind would return, walking straight into my new world, uninvited and unexpected. Years later, when I had built a life so far removed from the shadows of my past that even I sometimes struggled to believe it was real, fate reminded me that the past never truly disappears. I had become a man unrecognizable from the one who once stood humiliated on a city street, mocked and dismissed as though I were nothing. I wore tailored suits now, walked into buildings where the floors gleamed beneath my steps, and sat at tables where decisions worth millions were made with the stroke of a pen. People rose when I entered a room. They listened when I spoke, and in their eyes I saw not pity or dismissal, but respect. And yet, even in the midst of that success, I was not prepared for the day she walked back into my life. It began like any other meeting. I had a schedule full of negotiations, presentations, and deals that demanded my attention. My assistant handed me the day's agenda, and I glanced at it with the detached focus of a man accustomed to managing endless tasks. Her name on the list meant nothing to me at first, just another potential client, another meeting among many. It wasn't until she stepped into my office that the air shifted, heavy with a silence that seemed to carry the weight of every year that had passed. She walked in with the same elegance I remembered, though time had left its quiet marks upon her. Her clothes were still expensive, her posture still proud, but there was a fragility in her eyes that had not been there before. She greeted me politely, her voice steady, but when her gaze finally met mine, I saw it. The flicker of recognition, the spark of memory that turned her face pale. In that instant, I became both the shadow of her past and the embodiment of a future she could never have imagined. For a moment, neither of us spoke. I studied her carefully, remembering every detail of the girl who once stood above me, with arrogance dripping from her smile. She looked at me as though she were seeing a ghost, struggling to reconcile the poor driver she had once mocked with the man seated before her now. And I, though I had dreamed of this moment countless times, found myself unexpectedly calm. The anger I thought I would feel was absent. Instead, there was a strange sense of power, of quiet vindication. She tried to maintain her composure, but I could see the storm in her eyes. Her hands trembled slightly as she placed her papers on my desk, her voice faltering as she explained the purpose of her visit. Life had changed for her, too, though not in the way she might have expected. The wealth she once flaunted so carelessly was no longer secure. Her family's business, once untouchable, had begun to crumble, and she had come seeking partnership, investment, salvation. The irony was almost poetic. The girl who had once laughed at me now stood in my office, asking for help. As she spoke, I felt the weight of the years between us pressing down on my shoulders. I remembered the hunger, the loneliness, the betrayals, the endless nights of study and sacrifice. I remembered the insults, the rejection, the laughter that had once left me broken. And now, here she was, standing on the other side of the power she once used to wound me, her pride stripped away by the same merciless hand of fate that had once lifted her above me. Inside, I battled with myself. Part of me wanted to revel in the moment, to remind her of every cruel word, to make her feel the sting of humiliation she had inflicted on me. But another part of me, the part shaped by years of struggle and the wisdom of my mentor, urged me to see the bigger picture. This was not just about revenge. This was about choice, about the kind of man I had become. Still, I couldn't ignore the satisfaction of watching her squirm under the weight of recognition. When I finally spoke her name aloud, her eyes widened, her mask of composure cracking as she realized that I remembered her just as clearly as she remembered me. The silence that followed was charged, filled with everything unspoken between us. "I know who you are," I said, my voice steady, my gaze unflinching. "The question is, do you remember who I was?" Her lips parted, but no words came. I watched as the memory flooded back to her, as she saw not just the man before her, but the young driver she had once dismissed without a thought. The color drained from her face, and for the first time in our story, she was the one who felt small. That moment was everything I had once dreamed of, and yet it was nothing like I imagined. There was no triumphal laughter, no dramatic declaration of revenge. There was only silence, heavy and suffocating, as we both confronted the ghosts of who we had been. But fate was not finished with us. Her presence in my office was not an accident, not a fleeting encounter to be savored and forgotten. It was the beginning of a new chapter, one that would test me in ways even my years of struggle had not prepared me for. Because she did not just come asking for help. She came offering a deal that could change everything. And the decision I made in that moment would determine not just her future, but mine as well. When her eyes widened in shock, I knew the moment of recognition had struck her. It was as if time itself had folded in on her, dragging her back to that humiliating afternoon years ago, when she had looked at me with disdain, her laughter piercing me like a knife. Now, she stood before me, her polished exterior cracking, her composure unraveling under the weight of realization. I watched as pride gave way to disbelief, as disbelief gave way to fear, and in her trembling gaze, I saw the undeniable truth. She knew exactly who I was. The silence between us grew unbearable. She tried to speak, but her voice faltered, her lips moving without sound, as if searching for the right words to erase the cruelty of the past. I did not rush to fill the silence. I wanted her to sit in it, to feel the weight of every insult, every mocking word, every laugh that had once reduced me to nothing. For years, I had carried that pain alone, and now she was carrying it too. Right there, in the recognition burning in her eyes. "I remember you," she finally whispered, her voice trembling, fragile in a way I had never imagined. "You were—" She stopped, the word hanging heavy between us, too poisonous to finish. "The driver—" The title that had once been a prison now sounded hollow in her mouth. She said it not with arrogance but with regret, as though even naming it was a confession of her guilt. I leaned back in my chair, my gaze steady, my voice calm as I answered. "Yes, I was the driver. The one you mocked, the one you humiliated." I paused, letting the truth settle, watching her flinch under it. "But I am not that man anymore." Her eyes darted across the office, to the polished wood of my desk, the gold lettering of my name engraved on the plaque, the awards that lined the shelves, the staff who moved efficiently outside the glass walls. All of it screamed of power, of success, of a life far beyond anything she had imagined for me. And when her gaze returned to mine, I saw something I never thought I would see in her eyes. Respect laced with fear. It was strange, the way power shifted between us. Years ago she had held all of it, standing tall while I stood broken. Now the roles were reversed, and though part of me had dreamed of this vindication, I realized that it felt different than I had expected. There was satisfaction, yes, but there was also a heaviness, a question lingering in the air. What would I do with this power? She tried to recover, tried to smile, tried to wrap herself once more in the armor of charm that had once shielded her. "You've changed," she said softly, as though the words themselves were an understatement. "You've become impressive." But I could see through her facade. The fear in her eyes betrayed her. She knew she needed something from me, and she knew the power to decide her fate now rested entirely in my hands. Inside me, emotions clashed like storms. Part of me wanted to make her beg, to hear her apologize, to force her to admit the cruelty of her past. Another part of me wanted to rise above it, to prove that I was no longer chained to the boy she had once humiliated. My mentor's voice echoed in my mind. "The true measure of power is not what you take from others, but what you choose to give when they are at your mercy." Still, I could not deny the satisfaction of watching her struggle. Every flicker of recognition in her eyes, every stutter in her words, every moment of silence was a balm to the wounds she had once inflicted. I didn't need to humiliate her. Life had already done that. All I needed to do was decide how this story would unfold. "Tell me," I said finally, leaning forward, my voice low but steady. "Why should I help you?" Her breath caught, her confidence slipping further. She opened her mouth, closed it, and then opened it again, as though forming the answer was more painful than the memory of who I had once been. "Because—" She hesitated, her eyes dropping to the floor. "Because I need you." The irony of those words struck me with a force that nearly stole my breath. Years ago, I had needed her compassion, her respect, her acknowledgement, and she had denied me all of it. Now the roles were reversed, and she was the one standing in need, vulnerable, powerless. As the silence stretched again, I studied her carefully. She was no longer the untouchable figure of my past, the girl who had seemed larger than life. She was human now, fragile, stripped of the armor of arrogance. And though I had dreamed of this moment for years, standing in it felt far more complicated than I had imagined. For the first time, I realized that recognition was not just hers. It was mine too. I recognized the man I had become, the distance I had traveled from who I once was. And with that recognition came a choice, one that would define not just this moment, but the kind of man I would continue to be. But before I could decide, before I could speak the words that would either lift her or break her further, she made an offer so bold, so unexpected that it left me speechless. It was not just a plea for help, but a proposal that could change the very foundation of everything I had built. And as I listened, my heart pounded with the realization that this was no longer just about her, no longer just about the past. It was about the future, about choices that carried the weight of destiny itself. She asked for help, her voice trembling, stripped of the arrogance that had once defined her. It was not a demand, not a command disguised as charm, but a genuine plea, raw and unguarded. "Please," she said softly, almost too softly for me to believe it came from her. The girl who had once laughed at my poverty was now standing in front of me, her pride shattered, her words coated in desperation. And in that moment, I realized the strange, almost cruel symmetry of life. The very person who once made me feel powerless was now handing me all the power in the world. I sat there, watching her, feeling emotions collide inside me like storms raging against each other. Anger resurfaced, hot and sharp, reminding me of the day she had humiliated me, of the nights I had spent awake, bleeding silently under the weight of her words. Satisfaction whispered, urging me to savor this reversal, to let her taste the bitterness she had once fed me so easily. Yet beneath it all, another voice rose, the voice of my mentor, echoing in my memory. Power reveals who you are, not in how you rise, but in how you treat those who once stood above you when they fall. Her eyes searched mine, begging for mercy, for compassion, for something beyond the cold silence I was giving her. I could have ended it right there, with a single word, a single rejection that would crush her spirit the way she once crushed mine. I could have leaned back, smirked, and reminded her of every insult, every ounce of arrogance she had thrown at me, and then refused her with the same cruelty she had once shown me. The temptation was strong, intoxicating even. For years I had dreamed of this moment, and now it was within my grasp. But as I looked at her, I realized something unexpected. Revenge, as sweet as it promised to be, would not heal the wounds I carried. Humiliating her would not erase the nights I had gone hungry, the betrayals I had endured, the sacrifices I had made. It would not rewrite the years of struggle or restore the innocence that poverty had stolen from me. All it would do was chain me to the very bitterness I had spent my life trying to escape. Still, forgiveness did not come easily. She had not just rejected me. She had defined me with her rejection, reduced me to nothing in front of strangers, branded me with words that had haunted me for years. Even now, standing humbled before me, I could still hear that cruel laughter echoing in my ears. Could I truly rise above it? Could I let go of the fire that had fueled my journey all this time? I thought of the boy I once was, standing small and broken on that street, and I asked myself what he would want. Would he want me to strike back, to use this moment to reclaim his pride in the most brutal way possible? Or would he want me to become the man he always dreamed of being? Someone greater than the pain, someone who did not need revenge to validate his worth. She lowered her gaze, unable to hold my eyes any longer. And in that moment, she looked nothing like the untouchable figure of my past. She was human, fragile, flawed, just like me. Life had stripped her of her illusions, the same way it had once stripped me. And in that fragile silence, I saw her not as an enemy but as a mirror of who I might have been if fate had chosen differently. "Why should I help you?" I asked again, my voice steady, though inside I was trembling with the weight of the decision. Her answer was simple, yet it struck me with unexpected force. "Because you know what it feels like to have nothing, and you know what it means to lose everything." Her voice cracked on the last word, and though I wanted to remain cold, I felt something shift inside me. She was right. I did know. I had lived through hunger, betrayal, humiliation. I knew the taste of despair better than anyone, and perhaps that was why I could not bring myself to deny her completely. The power was mine, yes, but the choice of how to use it would define me. Would I be a man who mirrored her cruelty? Or would I be a man who proved that pain had not hardened me beyond redemption? The room grew silent as I leaned back in my chair, my mind torn between the satisfaction of vengeance and the liberation of forgiveness. My fingers tapped lightly against the desk, each beat echoing the pounding of my heart. I knew that whatever decision I made would not only alter her future, it would alter mine as well. And then, just as I prepared to speak, just as I prepared to decide, another voice interrupted the silence. My assistant entered the room, carrying a file that would change everything. A file filled with information I had not expected, information that revealed a truth about her situation that went far deeper than I realized. What I learned in that moment did not just complicate my decision. It shattered everything I thought I knew about her, about myself, and about the tangled fate that had bound our lives together from the beginning. Standing there with the file in my hands, I realized that power was not simply about wealth, influence, or status. It was about choice. And in that moment, the choice before me was heavier than any burden I had ever carried. The file revealed truths I had not expected, truths that stripped away the image I had held of her all these years. Her family's downfall had not been a slow decline, born of arrogance. It had been a collapse rooted in betrayal, in mismanagement, in the kind of cruel twists of fate I knew all too well. She had lost more than money. She had lost stability, security, and trust. For the first time, I saw her not as the villain of my story, but as someone who had been broken, just as I once was. The irony was bitter. All my life, I had been driven by her rejection, by the echo of her laughter, by the need to prove her wrong. And now, standing before me, she wasn't the arrogant girl of my past, but a woman humbled by suffering, a woman who had learned the same harsh lessons I had endured. The recognition in her eyes was no longer about who I had become. It was about who she no longer was. I sat in silence, the weight of years pressing down on me as she waited for my answer. My mind raced through every memory. The street where she had humiliated me, the nights I had gone hungry, the betrayal that had nearly broken me, the sacrifices that had cost me friends, health, and peace of mind. Each moment whispered in my ear, urging me toward revenge. And yet another voice rose above them all, the voice of my mentor, the man who had taught me that true strength was not found in cruelty, but in restraint, not in breaking others, but in choosing who you would become when given the power to do so. I looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time, I saw not the girl who had hurt me, but the woman standing before me now. She was fragile, vulnerable, human, and in that realization I understood that this decision was no longer about her. It was about me, about the man I had fought to become, about the legacy I would leave behind. Revenge would have been easy. A single word, a single rejection, and I could have watched her crumble, watched her feel the sting of humiliation I had carried for years. But revenge would also chain me to the past, bind me to the very pain I had worked so hard to escape. Forgiveness, however, was harder. It demanded strength, demanded that I let go of the fire that had fueled me for so long, demanded that I rise above everything I had endured. And so I made my choice. I leaned forward, my voice steady but not unkind, and said, "I will help you. Not because you deserve it, not because I have forgotten what you did, but because I refuse to let bitterness define me any longer. You once told me I would never be more than a driver. Today, I am proving to both of us that I am more than even revenge." Her eyes filled with tears, and for the first time, I saw sincerity in them. She whispered words I never thought I would hear. "I'm sorry." 2 simple words, but they carried the weight of years, the weight of a past that could not be erased, but could perhaps be forgiven. The decision did not erase the scars. It did not erase the hunger, the betrayal, the loneliness, or the sacrifices. But it did something even more important. It freed me. For years, I had been carrying the burden of her rejection, allowing it to shape me, drive me, and define my every step. By choosing forgiveness, I finally laid that burden down. Helping her was not about saving her business, nor was it about proving my power. It was about choosing the man I wanted to be. A man who had risen, not because of cruelty, but in spite of it. A man who had turned pain into strength, rejection into resilience, and betrayal into wisdom. As I walked her out of my office that day, I felt a strange sense of peace wash over me. The story that had begun on a hot afternoon years ago, when she had looked at me with disdain, had finally found its ending. Not in revenge, not in triumph, but in choice. My choice. Life, I realized, is not defined by what others say about us. It is defined by how we respond, by the choices we make when given the power to shape not only our destiny, but the destinies of others. And in choosing forgiveness over revenge, I proved to myself that I was no longer the poor driver she once mocked. I was a man who had walked through fire and emerged unburned, a man whose worth wasn't measured by her laughter or her approval, but by the strength of his own character. And though the scars of the past would always remain, they no longer defined me. They were simply reminders of the journey, reminders that even in the darkest moments, even when humiliation and betrayal threatened to break me, I had chosen to rise. That was the day I understood the true meaning of success. Not wealth, not power, not even respect, but freedom. The freedom to choose who I would be, no matter what the world had once told me I was. If this story moved you, don't just leave it here. Share your thoughts in the comments, because I'd love to hear how you would have made that final choice. Your support keeps these stories alive, so make sure to hit the like button and subscribe for more powerful journeys like this one. And if you know someone who needs to be reminded that no rejection can stop true determination, share this video with them today. Together, let's keep building a community that believes in rising above the past.